Welcome, everyone, to another edition of Governed by God, a biblical look at law, civics, and civil government. My name is Eric Loophole. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. So today, I want to look at the topic of education, specifically public education, and the role of the civil government in teaching children. In order to address this topic, I had the opportunity to interview Professor Jeffrey Tuomala, who was former Dean of the School of Law at Liberty University and is now a retired professor from there. He's also a retired colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve, and he served previously as consultant for Roy Moore, who was former Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. Professor Tuomala also taught at Regent University School of Law for 9 years and has written several books. And so without further ado, my interview with Professor Tuomala. Thank you, Professor Tuomala, for coming on to the show today. Really appreciate you accepting my invitation, and I look forward to our conversation specifically on the topic of education. But before we dive into that, would you be so kind as to tell the listeners who you are and what you do?
Okay, well, I'm currently retired from teaching. I'm retired from the Marine Corps Reserve. But who I am, saved by grace, my last year of law school. Went on active duty in the Marine Corps. Wanted to do full-time Christian ministry. So when my enlistment term was up, I got out, went to seminary. I had an Old Testament professor that showed how much the Bible had to say about law. And I thought, wow, law's my first love. And so I decided to stick with law because actually being a lawyer is full-time ministry of justice. So I went and got an advanced law degree at George Washington University, went back in the Marine Corps for a while, and then ended up teaching at Regent University for about 9 years there in the law school, with most of that time with Herbert Titus as the dean. And I also taught 3 years at Faulkner University in Alabama, and I was a founding faculty member, academic dean at Liberty Law School when it started. Classes started 20 years ago.
Wow. Hey, this is perfect because, I mean, this is why I wanted you to come on to the podcast today, because on this podcast, my goal is to help believers, help other Christians to think about law and government, every area of law. The title of this podcast is Governed by God, and I think there's a lot that God has to say about a variety of topics. So I'm curious as to what are some of the areas of law specifically that you focused on or really maybe enjoyed focusing on, and why those topics were your priority.
Well, my wife tells me whatever meal I'm eating, I say, this is the best I've ever had. And she said she doesn't doubt my honesty on that. It's just that, anyway, it seems like almost whatever class I'm teaching is my favorite class. There have been a couple exceptions, but the main areas in my early career I taught were in the criminal law and procedural area and international law. While I was at Liberty, I taught actually for 18 years constitutional law, and I've taught jurisprudence and legal history. Those are the other two areas that I really have taught a lot and really enjoyed. So it's quite broad. I've even taught torts, property, but it's more the public law area that's been it's my strongest area, the area I'm most interested in.
Okay. And for my part, like I recently heard you speak on a separate podcast regarding the topic of education. And that's when I listened to that, I said to myself, wow, I really need to get Professor Tuomala onto the show to talk about this, because it's a topic that's near and dear to my heart, the topic of education. And I know that a lot of Christians, myself included, have always assumed that education is just something that the civil government handles and should be allowed to handle. When my wife and I first moved here to Eastern Pennsylvania, we thought, oh yeah, we're gonna go with the public schools for at least K through 5th grade, see how it goes, and then maybe we'll consider Christian schooling for like middle school or high school. But that changed. Our opinion on that changed very quickly. And so now, from the very, very beginning, we very much value a Christian education. So even my, I guess, conversion on the topic of public education has been a recent change. So is that kind of a belief, the assumption that the government, well, it's just their job to provide education, and that's not an issue, and it's always been that way, and that's the way it should be. Is that a belief that you've encountered among Christians, and how have you tried to respond against that?
Well, I was an education major in college and taught in public school for a little bit before going to law school, and getting saved my last year in law school. And then hearing that that's about the time in the late 70s, the Christian school movement, at least amongst Protestants, as opposed to the Catholic parochial school movement, was getting started. And there was one in my home county, and I thought, oh, that's great. So I sent off a check to him. I just thought that was a good thing to do. I didn't have any theological basis for it. Just for whatever reason, that hit a responsive chord. And I had seen how much the public school that I taught in had deteriorated from the time I graduated there. And talking to the teachers there, it wasn't just my imagination. There was a huge change late 70s or late 60s and early 70s. And I didn't give that whole lot of thought about it. And going to seminary and having a course on Old Testament, dealing with the relationship of law and grace. That's what Dr. Kikasola focused on. And he took this from John Murray's Principles of Conduct. 3 things the law can do, 2 things the law can't do. The law can't save you. It can't make you free. It can't change you. And theologically, we know that. But somehow I made the connection, oh, that's civil law as well. And then the next quarter, he had Greg Bonson come and teach as a visiting professor at Ashland Theological Seminary in Ohio. And we used Rushdoony's book, Institutes of Biblical Law.
Wow.
And that was the first time I had ever heard somebody say, well, there's certain things that are in the jurisdiction of the state, other things that aren't. One of the things that's not in the jurisdiction of the state is education. So I was receptive. It didn't take any arm twisting or convincing for me on that. So that was the first big awakening, eye-opening intellectually. Before I went to seminary, the last thing anybody would have accused me of being is an academic or an intellectual. When I got saved and then really trying to figure out what Christianity was about, going to seminary, that was a huge change in my life. Well, I had gone back onto active duty. They said they'd station me in Washington, D.C. I wanted to get an advanced degree at George Washington to kind of bolster my resume, so to speak, because somehow I got it in my idea I would be teaching at a Christian law school someday. And went to a conference Howard Phillips put on and invited my Old Testament professor because Rushdoony was going to be speaking at that. So he came to D.C. We went to it. It was a great conference. And then Herb Titus got up and spoke. And he spoke the language of law. Rushdoony spoke the language of theology. Titus showed that, well, you don't really have to change the law. It's already there in the law. It's in the First Amendment. Quoting Thomas Jefferson, Almighty God has created the mind free. And it's sinful and tyrannical to tax a person for the propagation of opinions they don't believe. That's the Virginia law in the Virginia statute establishing religious freedom. So now I saw the legal, I saw it from the legal perspective, not just the theological perspective. So that was the clincher for me. I've seen other people, the reasons they give, quite often, well, we've got to save the public schools. We've got to be salt and light. That doesn't carry very much weight. If you as an adult can't accomplish that, how do you expect your children to? I don't want to say that it's necessarily a bad motive, but I think the cost is for some people. the thought that, well, maybe they wouldn't get as good of an education in a Christian school or homeschooling. I think those play there. I think most people haven't given it thought. They haven't heard it. And I think some pastors, well, they may not believe it themselves, or they're afraid that it will cause controversy in their churches. And I picked up on that over the years. It'll make public school parents feel like they're second class, something of that nature. So there's a host of different reasons. I think quite often people come around just because they see the problems with the schools like today. Other people, if you get in your mind, this is the right thing to do, most people can find a way to do it. So it's really a question of being convinced. But a lot of times it's a matter, just never thought of that before.
Yeah. I was wondering if you maybe wanted to give some historical background as far as like, has it always been the case in the United States that education is a public thing and it's always the job of the civil government to handle that?
Well, I would say that for 1,800 years of Christendom, the state basically was not the educator. It was basically the church, families, private associations. Now, the church, in a lot of ways, would get entangled with the state, and you can't keep things totally clear on that, but it wasn't a state function. When it really in this country started was in the 1830s with the Common School movement, Horace Mann in Massachusetts, which is interesting because it was in the 1830s that Massachusetts became the last state to disestablish the church. And as soon as it did that, it established the school. But both of those are religious enterprises. So they traded state-established churches and then substituted state-established schools that did many of the same functions we see today that the church historically did. So that was a big turning point. It wasn't until after the Civil War that the common school or public school movement started getting geared up, and into the 1900s when it became basically the assumption that that's the state's responsibility and will tolerate Christian and private education, but basically the state school is there for everybody else.
And it seems like for the most part, it was ran by the individual states, and only recently, I think maybe in the 1970s or so, did we get the Department of Education at the federal level. So now there's another layer of civil power that's involved in education. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that it was during the Carter administration, I believe, that the Department of Education was established as at least as a cabinet post, and there have been threats, renewed threats with the incoming administration to do away with the Department of Education. I'm not sure how much there was still federal money and things going to education even before then, but with the Department of Education, I think there was a lot more centralization that came into from the federal government in terms of standard, in terms of financing. Once you have the financing, then you can put the conditions to control the way things are going to go. A couple other things. I think that's part of a more general movement. In the late 50s and early 60s, this is in Ohio, and during time I can remember, there was a consolidation movement of schools. So, for example, my little hometown area, there were 3 high schools. They all merged into one. I think probably a lot of city schools got bigger and bigger. So there's a loss of contact, I think, and comfort with parents being involved with the school, knowing the teachers, and so on. And so I think that consolidation movement was probably, if you're thinking public schools are a good thing, that was probably harmful in many ways, but just my observation. And that's generally where our country has gone in terms of constitutionality, increasing centralization rather than decentralization. And we see that really in the education system.
That's interesting because I remember as part of my studies after COVID, or during COVID, I should say, I recall reading an article where Governor DeSantis of Florida, he had basically said that the schools in Florida cannot mandate masking on the students, and all 6 feet rule and all the things like that, and he basically threatened the schools in Florida that if they disobey him, then they're going to get cut off from state funding. But then I recall reading on the Department of Education, the federal Department of Education, they created a grant, and this grant was kind of like it was called like the COVID grant or whatever the case may be. And essentially, it argued that if any school lost funding from at the state level because of whatever, not being allowed to mandate masking, that the Department of Education would give money directly to that school, essentially trying to bypass the authority of the state government and to prop up the schools and make the school basically more dependent upon the federal government and obey the federal requirements of like masking and spacing and all the things like that. So I just found that to be a very interesting attempt at centralization and taking power away from the states in the realm of education.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular tactic. The question is, what in the Constitution gives the federal government the power to regulate education at all?
Yeah.
And generally, it's either going to come under the Commerce Clause, okay, which the Supreme Court has interpreted extremely expansively. Basically, any economic activity that has a substantial effect on interstate commerce in the aggregate, Congress can regulate. The other is through the Spending Clause, giving money to the states, supposedly for general welfare, but then putting conditions on how that's going to be spent and regulations that would come with that. Now, a state doesn't have to accept that money, but their citizens are paying into it, and it's hard then for the state to say no to it. And those two clauses of the Constitution are the main, that's the threshold largely for the federal government to exercise so much control over Americans' lives, including education.
Yeah, it's that phraseology of the Constitution, general welfare. I mean, it's so broad that you can import a lot of things into that concept of, well, this is for the general welfare and interstate commerce, and it seems like that's what they've done in many areas. That essentially they've spread their net into every area because, well, it's all for the general welfare of everybody.
But I tell my students, basically, Congress can do anything that they think is good for America under those, and the court will uphold it.
Ooh, that scares me. That scares me when
you're right
say...
on the general welfare, that language. And I don't think it means whatever is good for America. It's spending for things that states cannot do themselves, or it would be very difficult to. So, for example, states can have their own armed forces, but it's highly impractical and it didn't work. States aren't individually able to regulate interstate commerce without having treaties with others. So that's in Congress. So there are certain things by the very nature of the union that the states can't do themselves. So those things that they can't are for the general welfare. Education, every state can handle matters themselves, and it shouldn't be through the general welfare clause spending that Congress can take care of that. Yeah. One of the big problems is the Supreme Court, most justices don't have an appreciation for Chief Justice Marshall called the object test. What is the purpose that this enumerated power is there for? You have to ask what the purpose is, or as he would say, the object. That's getting into some constitutional interpretation, but just so much hinges on the interpretation of a very few words and how you go about defining the nature of those powers.
Yeah. So with that in mind, given the difficulty that it seems like we're facing in that regard, like how should we as Christians, even if we're not involved in the government, because we all vote, we all have some civic power in that regard, how should we approach this topic and seek to maybe decouple education from the civil government? How do we even begin to tackle this problem?
Well, in the first place is to start with, okay, I'm gonna figure out how to educate my children, my grandchildren, my neighbors, contribute to them, help them, support them in either homeschooling, and there's so many different programs and options out there, or with Christian schooling. And so that's a place to start. Now, in terms of more generally, and I've put this out, and I don't want to harp too hard on it, but in our form of government, the people are the sovereign. They have a duty to exercise their sovereign responsibilities, including voting and voting for those things that the government should or shouldn't do. Now, pastors want to stay away from that. They want to say, well, that's political in nature. Well, if those are our duties, and this is a proper form of government, if we're doing the wrong things, we need to know what those are for the purpose of repenting, confessing, and doing what's right. Now, I don't expect the light on every matter to come on everybody's head at the same pace or time or speed that it came on in mine. And I find quite often, I guess this is a kind of a warning, young people especially, they get an idea, they've got it, and maybe they're not real tactful in the way they approach that or push it, or they expect everybody else to come to enlightenment as quickly as they did or when they did. So there's a role to be talked about it and promoted that would come in large measure. We're seeing the public school system it's got real problems. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe the mindset is more, we've got to have things in place. Somebody's got to step in, kind of like during the Middle Ages when the civilization collapses, the monks step in and they preserve learning. We've got to be ready and know how to do that and step in. That's my guess. And then, talking to your neighbors. I don't know in terms, if I were running for office, there's a young woman that recently got elected to city council. Mm-hmm. We've known her for a long time. We know her father in Virginia, the school or the city council. She ran for city council, not school board. I may have misspoke. But they control funds for the schools. If you're going to take the position, well, we have no role here in funding education, we're just going to cut the schools off. First of all, you're not going to get elected again. You're probably not going to pull it off. And, it's tough. I don't think politicians basically are going to change it. It's going to change because people say, oh, we need to have an alternative. This is the right thing to do. We're willing to commit our resources to it. Maybe someday there'll come a point where politicians will say, hey, this is socialization. This is communism. We don't want to be socialists. But I don't think people see that, at least not right away.
Yeah, I guess there's almost two questions here, or 2 points that you could make. The first being, well, state-run education in the United States, basically the civil government, federal government especially, does not have the legal authority, the constitutional authority to do that. So, that's kind of point number one. yes, they are doing it, but they should not be doing it per our own rules in our government. And then, but someone might say, well, okay, sure, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Like that doesn't mean that they shouldn't do it. Maybe we just gotta clean up the Constitution a little bit, but why not let the civil government handle education? That's kind of the question I want to ask you is, what is so bad or wrong about the civil government handling education?
Well, from a Christian point of view, my understanding, you can't have education except on a Christian basis. All the treasures and wisdom and knowledge are found in Christ. Anything not done in faith is sin. Through Christ, all things are created and hold together. How can you have a true understanding and portrayal of the world without that basis? Now, the way the First Amendment is understood today, that would preclude the state from basing education on truth. So they couldn't approach it that way. Most state constitutions, probably all of them, have a provision that the state will provide a system of public schools. So that would be a legal matter that would have to be resolved at those places. Now, in all constitutional litigation, basically any challenge to a state statute or a federal statute, either under the Due Process Clause or Equal Protection Clause, the court says, is there a legitimate state interest? And I'll ask my students, can you think of anything the state does that's not a legitimate interest or purpose? And they go, no. How about this? How about if the state told you what to think? Is that legitimate? Well, of course not. So public schools are unconstitutional. Oh, people don't think through the implications of that. Part of it is a definition of religion. Okay? First Amendment, free exercise of religion. State shall not establish a religion. The Supreme Court really has not defined religion. They want to separate secular and religious, but they haven't defined secular either. So public schools can be based on secular truth, perspective, but not religious. The way Virginia defined and Madison defined religion is the duty we owe to our Creator and the manner of discharging it. And those things, so it's a jurisdictional matter. Those things that can be backed up by force or violence, that's not in the jurisdiction of religion. Everything else is a matter of conscience. So the question is, what is legitimate for the state to be doing and backing up by force or violence? It's not a narrow little theological definition. It requires an expansive, a whole worldview. What is properly in the jurisdiction of the state and what is not? And, the Virginia statute says, Jefferson actually wrote his draft of the statute. The state has no jurisdiction over the mind. That language got taken out, but that principle is clearly still there. God has created the mind free. It's sinful and tyrannical to tax a person, propagation of beliefs they don't hold. And the Supreme Court has said that the principles, the object of the Virginia statute establishing religion is basically the same as the First Amendment. They haven't come to grips with it. It's there in our laws. They state stuff that backs the position I'm putting up, but they're contradictory and statements they make and positions they hold.
I had a question about a recent bill. Maybe you're familiar with this. Let me know if you are. But there was a bill in Louisiana that it seems like that state is trying to challenge the secular concept of education. And this bill, it's House Bill 71, you may have heard about it on the news, where basically Louisiana, the government has declared that public schools, elementary, secondary schools, will display the Mayflower Compact, Declaration of Independence, Northwest Ordinance, and the Ten Commandments in every classroom. Every classroom has to have those documents, and I think they're probably going through various lawsuits or whatnot. But their argument is that, well, these things are part of the history and tradition of the United States, and therefore it's perfectly fine for a state government to mandate the Ten Commandments to be on a classroom. I was just curious as if you were familiar with that or what your thoughts were on that kind of a attempt.
I'm not familiar with the particulars, but from what you've described, they're trying to base this on the challenge to Christmas displays, nativity scenes, or Christmas creches. Mm-hmm. So you can put Jesus in there as long as you've got Santa, snowman, and various other things. So somehow that's okay. So they're trying to show and put up all of those different documents. And so they're part of our history. They're part of our background. Supposedly that's not that's not a religious display. Okay. Whether the court goes with that or not, I don't know. There would be basis on Supreme Court, I think, precedent to say that's okay. A more difficult one is where I forget the particulars. In Oklahoma, I believe they've mandated Bible reading because there was fears that they were going to adopt the Trump Bible, I think I read. But anyway, the Supreme Court quite often will say the First Amendment means we've got to be neutral towards religion. You can't favor one religion over another religion, and you can't favor non-religion over religion or vice versa. Well, the whole public school system is set up favoring non-religion over religion.
It's true.
Now, if they're going to be equal protection, they've kind of turned religious belief and status into almost like racial or sexual or gender discrimination. You can't discriminate. If you have one, you've got to have the other. I suspect that's part of their thinking there. And there's plenty in Supreme Court precedent to back them up. We're going to treat them the same. We're going to be neutral between religion and non-religion. We have all of this non-religion. We're going to be neutral and put some religion there. That may be what's going on there. Here's my view on that, because I think education by its very nature is religious. Okay? It falls within the realm of conscience. It's not something the state can back by force or violence. You really shouldn't have prayer in public schools because there shouldn't be public schools.
Amen.
That's the situation on that. Now, probably the bigger issue that's coming here is going to be vouchers. And you had made mention of vouchers. Vouchers would probably help break the public school monopoly, but it still holds out the prospect of government control over what's taught eventually. But I'm not even basing it on that, my position. My position is simply the state has no jurisdiction over that. So it shouldn't be paying vouchers to Christian schools, non-Christian schools, both equally, and so on and so forth. The voucher system, charter schools that maybe even be chartered, religious charter schools, they're breaching the principle God has created the mind free. It's sinful and tyrannical to tax a person for the propagation of opinions they don't believe. Now, interestingly, there was a case, the Janus case, about probably been 5 or 6 years ago by now, where Justice Alito wrote an opinion, and he twice cited the Virginia statute, it's sinful and tyrannical, or actually quoted it. And the issue there was, would a state or a public employee to pay funds to a public employee labor union? And the court ruled no. They can't force them to pay for the collective bargaining or the separate political activities of the labor union. and they cited the Virginia statute. It's sinful and tyrannical to pay force that person to pay for beliefs they don't hold. Now, the irony of that is if that public employee is a public school teacher, the taxpayers can be forced to pay that teacher's salary, but he can't be forced to pay a union due, which is much less.
Wow.
There's a disconnect there, okay, between from this case to the next, and you see those conflicts. So it asked Justice Alito, which is it? Does the state have jurisdiction over the mind or not? What's that have to say with public schooling? Now they've realized, they've come to the point, there's been several free exercise clause cases in the last few years where the court has said, if you give money for certain tax incentives and things to a private non-Christian school, you have to treat Christian schools, church, whatever, equally, or it's a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. That's why I said they're coming close to treating religious belief kind of like minority status. But they haven't taken that principle and said, and if you give money to set up a public non-religious school system, you must treat religious school systems equally. Now, if they took that principle, and I think that's where they're going, people that are pushing vouchers, these will be constitutional based on these recent free exercise clause cases. It makes sense, but the funding is going to be far greater than these other cases. But the principle has been set there, and they see it. Now, trying to get the court to see, I don't think you're going to get the court to say, wow, public schools, they're favoring those. They're going to have to treat private schools equally. They're going to have to fund all schools equally. I don't think they're going to force it, but I think they'll allow it.
Interesting. Because I wanted to get your thoughts on something related to that. So in Pennsylvania, we have a EITC, which is Education Income Tax Credit. But essentially, if I donate money, if I give my money to a private school, it could be a Christian school or a non-Christian school, but it's a private school. If I donate money to that school, I will get a tax credit from the state of Pennsylvania on my income tax. So essentially, what's happening is instead of paying my taxes to Pennsylvania government, I'm just giving that money to a local private school. And that's grown in popularity, and now many schools are taking advantage of that, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And what's interesting, though, is we had some concerns because there's still that question as to, well, who qualifies to get this tax credit? And our state government is kind of split: conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat. We have a Democrat House, a Republican Senate, and a Democrat governor. But there were concerns that there are a group of Democrats that are pushing to make the case like, well, schools that are not pro-LGBTQ plus are not eligible for this income tax credit. If you were to donate to those schools, you would not get reimbursed. So there's still that argument that the government has a leash on the money, or who gets to get the tax credit, and it's not complete freedom. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, that's a great example where the state is not going to. They're going to try to control who the schools are, what they're taught. If they're going to be, whether it's tax credits, whether it's vouchers or whatever, they will try to maintain their control that way. Those are good prudential arguments not to go down those roads. The position I'm taking is a constitutional principle basis. They have no jurisdiction. Now, I would say, somebody's vouchers and that sort of thing, it might help break the public school monopoly, but you've got to keep in mind what the real end game is. And the real end game is the state has no jurisdiction over these matters. And that's hard because once you become dependent on it, very hard.
Because that's the argument, right? The question is, I hear this all the time with other things. If I were to say, you know what would be nice? Maybe we should try to have privatized roads. And then people would say, well, there wouldn't be any roads. There'd be nothing. Like, how are people going to get from one place to the other if the government doesn't handle it? And the same thing for education. Well, if we don't have public schools, all these kids, they're not going to be educated. Like, what will happen? I know there's a fear behind that there, and there is also a pragmatic aspect to it. The analogy that I tend to give is, well, if a drug addict has been on drugs for a long period of time, it is very hard and maybe unwise to just cut cold turkey. And if you were to do that, the person might die or go through some significant problems. And so the solution, we've had this bloated system that's very, it's embedded, and it's very hard to come out of that. And it might take some gradual steps to eventually privatize things and get away from this statist or socialist mindset. I'm not saying that it can be done tomorrow, or that even it would be necessarily wise to say, okay, well, tomorrow there'll be no funding for public schools at all. We are done. Good luck. That would certainly cause a lot of disruption. And I don't know. What are your thoughts on that concept?
Well, I agree that it would cause tremendous disruption. And near the beginning of our conversation, I had made the comment that we have to have things in place and be thinking about what would replace that. How are we going to spend the money? Of course, there would be tremendous tax savings. And people quite often raise the question, well, who's going to educate kids in poor towns? Let's just say a northern city in the ghetto. And it's a good question. But maybe the first question is to be answered, who's educating them now? When you see the results coming out of Cleveland, Ohio, or Baltimore, there's something really, really, sad and drastic going on there. There are so many things we spend money on, either as a government or as individuals. If Christians were really serious about this, it may change some of their spending, way they spend their free time and things to build schools. You don't need, I don't know that most schools have climbing walls and that sort of thing, but there are a lot of things that aren't necessary, is my thinking. If you really want to teach kids to read, do basic mathematics and things, it could be done probably very, very much more efficiently than it is today. And I suppose if you had schools that are spread out, not big consolidated ones where kids are going, that would probably be helpful as well. I spoke at a conference, Christian Education Initiatives. And for example, they had Lee Borton's from Classical Conversations there speaking, and others from other groups. There are a lot of very, very creative and thoughtful people out there doing a lot of really good things. If we put our minds to it, there's a lot of creativity in doing things. Yeah, I asked somebody, which government agency runs Little League? How many dads are out there coaching Little League? You mean they couldn't also be teaching things? They couldn't organize for those purposes and things of that nature? And parents, it's a matter of priorities, how you spend your time, how you spend your money. In regard to that, and some people really find fault with this, I suppose, what better evangelism opportunities would there be than to have schools that would be set up? And who's most likely to set up schools and educate poor and disadvantaged kids. Well, traditionally it's been the church, its mission efforts and various charitable efforts and hurricane relief efforts and other things that, we could be doing that. We should be doing that.
Yeah, that's a good word, and I completely agree and appreciate that statement. And I know we're coming to the end of our time here, so I wanted to ask if you had any final thoughts or if you had any resources that you would really recommend listeners to look at to understand this better, or ways that they can follow you in your work.
If you're looking for the constitutional arguments, I've got an article that I had written for a symposium we did on education at the law school last spring. If somebody were to type my name in, Jeffrey C. Tuomala, Digital Commons, anything I've written would come up. And this article in particular is Tax-Funded Education Unconstitutional. It's in the volume 18 of the Liberty University Law Review. That's a long article. It's over 100 pages. It's probably not for everybody, but it really sets out I think the constitutional issues. And also at the end of it, I give a biblical basis why education must be Christian and why the state has no jurisdiction over that. So I'm not just going with the constitutional arguments. Also explain the theological, philosophical basis why people think you could have public schooling, that there's some kind of public realm and public knowledge, and religion is some kind of small, exclusive, private area, and you just can sort those out. Do your religion on Sunday at Sunday school or catechism after school, and your regular education, your secular education can be done perfectly well by the state. So I look at those and explain, there's a bigger worldview question with all of this. So there are legal principles, there are worldview issues, there are specifically biblical issues. There are lots of other people that really look at the political reasons, the prudential reasons, why Christian education is better, why public schools aren't working. And then there are lots of resources out there, and I don't follow that aspect of them without, younger children. Here's how to go about it. There's a lot of really good resources and kind of programs. And probably most churches by now, at least evangelical churches, have some network of homeschoolers that share ideas, direct resources, encouragement, and so on.
No, I really appreciate that. And again, thank you for the work that you're doing. And thank you for coming on today and chatting with me about education.
Thank you, Eric.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed that interview with Professor Tuomala on the topic of education. Definitely a lot to think about regarding how to move forward with education in the United States. And I highly recommend that you take a look at the paper that he wrote on whether or not the civil government has the authority to tax people to provide for public education. These are things we definitely need to think through if we're going to be able to make any improvements at all in our current system. Of course, if you have any questions for me that I can pass on to Professor Tuomala, please email me at thegbgpodcast@gmail.com or go on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and look for Governed by God and message me there. So with that, thank you for tuning in, and until next time, take care and God bless.